Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Simone here, and today I'm going to be filming my most surprising books of 2019. Now this feels a little bit late in the month to do this, but I said at the beginning of, or the end of December, that I was planning on doing these videos at this time, and I still think it's interesting to know, even if it is nearing the end of January. So basically these are going to be 10 books that I found to be the most surprising. They are not necessarily, in fact they are not my favourite books of the month. I will link down below and in the cards my best books of 2019, which I loved, but this is basically going to be 10 books that I was not expecting to love as much as I did, or that surprised me in some way. I think most of these I gave like a 3 or 4 star, but yeah, I really loved these books, and I found them surprising, so I'd love to talk to you about them. There will be a most disappointing one coming in a few days time, but yeah, let's get started and let's talk about the books that surprised me. I don't own any of these because, as you know, I don't keep books, but I will put pictures on the screen so you know what I'm talking about. So the first one, and these are not in any order at all, but there is 10 of them. So the first one is Paper Girls Volume 1. This is by, I think it's by Brian K. Vaughan, but I could be wrong. I've read, I think, 3 graphic novels this year, and the reason why this one is on this list is because it was so good. I loved it. I think I gave it a 4 star, and I would never have expected me to be somebody who enjoyed reading graphic novels. It's just never been my thing. But then I read a few this year, like I said, and I loved this one. This one is actually also one I read on my Kindle, and I found that I really enjoy the reading experience on my Kindle of reading graphic novels, because on your Kindle you can go from like block to block as opposed to having to see the whole thing, and it really helped me to like know what the flow of it was, and I just really enjoyed that myself. I don't know if anyone else has the same like views on that, but I really loved this one. This follows a group of paper girls who basically deliver papers in the evenings and overnight in this little town, and then stuff starts to happen. There's like creepy stuff, and there's like zombies and ghouls and different creatures and all sorts, and it's really, really good. It's very, very good, very much worth the read. It's not a really long read either because it is a graphic novel, but I absolutely loved it, and yeah, I would highly recommend that if you haven't read any graphic novels and you want to give it a go, to try that one. I do really want to read the other volumes because, like I said, I've only read volume 1, but I loved it. The second one I want to talk about is Ugly Love by Colleen Hoover. So I've heard some pretty negative things about Colleen Hoover as a author in general, and I have also read some excerpts from other books of hers that I found really problematic. So I don't deny that there are some issues there with her writing and with her characterization and her lack of consent, which tends to happen a lot in her books, and I know that a lot of people actually have problems with this particular book as well. I personally enjoyed Ugly Love. It basically follows a girl named Tate who moves in with her brother, who is a pilot. She moves into his apartment building, and on the day she moves in, she finds a passed out drunk guy basically outside the front of her brother's apartment, and turns out he lives just across the way from them, and it kind of goes from there. There's a really lovely romance in this, and it's the age-old like friends with benefits thing without like, you know, will they catch feelings and all that. I just really enjoyed it. I think it's one of those books, it's like not the best book ever written, but it was just enjoyable. I found it really interesting. It was really good to take my mind off the day if I just had a really rubbish day and I wanted something fun to read in the evenings. And I know that some people have a problem with like the sexual content, I guess, but I just found it to be really enjoyable. I loved it, and I just think that, yeah, it was the book I needed to read at the time I read it, so yes, I highly recommend. Number 3 is Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. This is a book that the reason why this is a surprise is that this is probably my favourite, or at least second favourite Jane Austen book, and I really, really enjoyed this one. So I've always loved Emma and Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice has always been my like second to Emma because I love Emma more than Pride and Prejudice, but I actually think Mansfield Park might possibly be edging Emma. I think mainly because the protagonist, Fanny, is actually one of my favourite people. I love her character. I think she's incredible, and I just honestly really enjoy it. So it basically follows what happens when, I think Fanny is 10 years old, and her rich aunt and uncle basically take her in because the family that she's living with, so her actual family, are quite poor, and so they decide to help take the burden of one of the relatives, basically. And it's about her trying to come to terms with, or trying to figure out what her place in a world where, you know, she's suddenly around sort of money and balls and people and enjoy like things that she loves, and she gets to actually do these things, and she's also missing her family, of course. And yeah, it's just a really lovely book. I really enjoy Fanny as a character. Like I said, she's just very she is a little bit naive at times, and a little bit kind of she can be a bit whiny, and some people don't like that, but I just found her to be really fun, and I really loved her as a character. So yeah, I think that was why this was such a surprise for me. The next one I really enjoyed and surprised me was Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. I will preface this by saying that I would very much like to read, so there's a book that was written by a geisha about the fact that this is not necessarily a true to real life thing, because obviously Arthur Golden is a white male, and he wrote a story about geishas and about the world that they live in, and I believe that a geisha wrote like a response book, basically, and I would love to read that, because I definitely want to read something that's a bit more authentic. But what I did enjoy about this was I felt it was quite respectful. Now obviously it might not be true to life, and it might not be what actually happens, but I found it to be an enjoyable read. And I just found it to be kind of, I think, like I said, although it could be a bit problematic, I did enjoy the themes in this book. I really enjoyed the characters and the characterization, and I just found that the characters in general made me really feel for them. I felt like I learned quite a lot about some of the culture. Obviously now I don't know how much of that is true, but obviously I would love to read that response, because I think it would be great. But I was surprised by this because I wasn't sure how I was going to feel, because I've always thought of Memoirs of a Geisha as kind of like a classic in some ways, or like a modern classic. I don't actually know when it was written, but I also really enjoyed the film, and I often find if I've seen the film first, I get a bit disappointed by the book in the end, because I've got the other way around. So yeah, I enjoyed this one a lot, and I'm really glad I read it. Next up in number 5 is Sushi for Beginners by Marian Keyes. I think I read this one in November, or was it December? I think it was November. I read this one quite quickly, even though it's a massive book. So it follows 3 women in different stages of their lives, and they are each, Marian Keyes is an Irish author, and it follows one woman who lives in Ireland, and she is now an editor at a magazine. She's the assistant editor to a woman who thought that she was getting a promotion to New York, and got what she felt like was a demotion to run her own magazine in Dublin. And then it also follows the woman who is the assistant editor. It follows her best friend, who has a kind of stay-at-home life where she's looking after her children. She has a wonderful husband. In fact, she has everything her best friend wants, but it's just not enough for her. And I found sometimes I don't really like this kind of like women's fiction, like the stereotypical chick lit phrase, but I actually just really loved this one. I felt like it really tackled some pretty hard topics, but it was done in a really light-humoured, kind of light-hearted, funny way, and I loved that. I've always loved Marian Keyes as an author in general, so yeah, I shouldn't be surprised that I enjoyed it so much, but I definitely did, and I would 100% love to read more of her books. Number 6 is Ghosts of the Tsunami by Richard Lloyd Parry. This is a book, a non-fiction book, that takes place around the Japanese tsunami that happened, I believe, in 2001, and Richard Lloyd Parry actually lives in Japan, and was living in Japan at the time of the tsunami, and he lived away from where everything happened, but he's a reporter, and I think he's for a newspaper, was it a news station, and he was one of the first people to report on what happened. And this particular book not only follows the tragedy of obviously so many people, but what he focuses mainly on is the fact that there was a school that was in the middle of this, where a lot of young children died because seemingly because the school teachers did not evacuate them, and did not tell them, or did not follow the evacuation plan to move them up onto a higher point of ground where they would have survived, and it's kind of about what happened. It was all hushed up a little bit, and so it talks a bit more about like the court cases. It talks a lot about the families and how they're dealing with, you know, missing loved ones, lost loved ones, confirmed dead loved ones. Like, it's just really, it's really, really heartbreaking to read, but it was a wonderful, wonderful book, and it's definitely non-fiction I would like to continue and read more about, because I tend to read a lot of true crime, but I don't tend to read a lot of kind of like other non-fiction like that type of style, so I'm very much interested in reading more. So if you have any recommendations, do let me know. But yeah, this one surprised me because I wasn't really sure what to expect. Next up, number 7, we have Wolf by Wolf by Ryan Groudon. This is a book that I'd had on my shelf for a really long time and finally picked it up in 2019, and I really, really loved it. It basically, and again, it's not one I should have been surprised by, but because I think I'd heard so many things about it, it was one of those things where you're like, have I heard too much? Is this going to be like not for me anymore? But this basically is a like a flipped version, or like flipped reality of what would have happened if Hitler had won the war, and it's about like the Allied forces, etc. But the main story follows a girl who enters a motorbike race, and because she wants to win the race, and if she wins the race, then she gets to meet Hitler in person, where she wants to kill him. And so it's very interesting. It also has a bit of like magical elements in, because she's a shapeshifter, and yeah, it's really interesting. It's got a few different bits in it that I wasn't sure how I'd feel, like the magical side. It's not like a true to life kind of non-fiction, obviously not non-fiction, it's not a true to life historical fiction, because obviously it's a different like reality, I guess. But I really enjoyed it. Like I said, I definitely would recommend, and I think there's a sequel which I would love to read as well. Then we have a book that I was sent for review by Book Publicity Services, so a massive thank you to them. This one is, I believe, a like, it's kind of middle grade, but it's a magical, I don't really know, it kind of reminds me of the same target audience as like Harry Potter, the earlier books. This was Thomas Wildus and the Book of Sorrows by J.M. Bergen, which I found to really enjoy. I wasn't really sure. I got sent this for review and I was a bit like, oh no, this is going to be one of those books where I get sent a book for review and I have to say I don't like it, because obviously I'm completely honest in my reviews, but I was a bit worried, thinking, oh no, they'll never send me anything ever again. But I ended up giving it 4 stars because I loved it. It basically follows a young boy who, his father is no longer on the scene, and basically he one day gets involved, he gets kind of drawn to this bookshop where they give him a magic book and they tell him to read this book and he'll figure it out, and then magic starts to happen basically. And him and his best friend, I think his best friend's Enrique, I want to say, but he is such a wonderful character. Together, the two of them, their friendship is beautiful, and I just love that although it isn't anything like Harry Potter really, it still gave me the same sort of feels as that, because it had the sort of friendships and the magic elements. Now obviously the story is completely different, but yeah, I just absolutely loved it and I would highly recommend it if you haven't read it already. Then we have the penultimate one, and this is a book that I was recommended by the lovely Charlie from Charlie Brook. This is The Crossover by Kwame Alexander. This is actually a book written in verse, which is the reason why this is so surprising to me. So I had not previously read any books written in verse as far as I know. I wasn't really wanting to either, but I saw this in my local library. I think it was right at the start of the year actually, and Charlie had mentioned I think another Kwame Alexander book, and she loves him, and I was like, okay, I need to try this, just at least to try it from the library, see how I feel. And basically The Crossover is about brothers whose father, I can't remember if they're brothers or twins, but they are definitely brothers to some extent, and they are sort of mad about basketball, and they play it all the time. Their father used to be a basketball player, and they love it, and so a lot of the rhythms in the poems are quite like basketball, you know, I was going to say dribbling, but you know what I mean. And yeah, it sounded interesting. I was curious, and then basically one of the brothers gets a girlfriend, and it's about what happens, it's the jealousy and that kind of thing, and I absolutely loved it. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful book and highly recommend, and I think it's a great one to read with young children as well, to talk about jealousy and to talk about sports, and yeah, it was just wonderful. And then the final one is one I read on my Kindle, completely out of the blue. I just picked up a Kindle book because I didn't have a physical book with me at work at one point, and I read Trail of Broken Wings by Sejal Badani. This is a book written by an Indian author about an Indian family. So this follows the mother and father. The father is in a coma because he is, and he's not expected to come out of that coma. He's in the hospital, and basically the mother and her 3 daughters all are having a very difficult time trying to come to terms with this, not necessarily because he's in a coma and they're sad about it, although they are to some extent, but because he was very abusive to them all in very different ways, and the family has been fractured quite a lot, and the 3 daughters have sort of taken different parts from that, and it's caused them to do different things. Like, one of them moved away because she didn't want anything to do with it. One of them was like her father's favourite, so she very much like thrived with that, and now obviously coming to terms with everything else that happened. And honestly, the whole thing was just, it's a great book. It's definitely worth the read. It's really good, and yeah, I just found it really fascinating and highly recommend. So there you are, guys. Those are the 10 books that I was most surprised by in the year 2019. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these and what you thought, and also what was the book that surprised you the most last year. It doesn't have to be your favourite book of the year, but one that really surprised you. So leave me a comment down below and let me know all of those things. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time for another video. Bye, guys.